All right, Arif, should I start now? All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to the first forum of the 10th Curriculum Integration Program. I'm Ghulam Qadir Zilani, Senior Lecturer, Department of English and Humanities. Before we start our session formally, probably it would be convenient for everyone if we keep our microphone muted, ask questions during the question answer session, only when designated at the end of the session. And in case our questions are urgent, it is requested to share questions using the chat features. At this stage, I would like to welcome Professor Shamshad Murtuza, Special Advisor, Board of Trustees, University of Learners, Bangladesh, to share a few words about the rationales behind introducing curriculum integration program for the students of Department of English and Humanities.
Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to speak. So it's not actually fair on the speakers as well as the listeners. So maybe we should go ahead with, Sudeep does talk and I'll share my comments at the end. We all know, what this is all about. And, everyone is eagerly waiting for the first forum. So let's get ahead with it.
All right, thank you so much, sir. Um, So the theme which we have chosen in this particular semester is navigating geopolitical realities, the role of language and literature. In fact, geopolitics, it is not confined to maps and territories alone. In today's world, the role of geopolitics is noticed everywhere, which includes shaping international relations, influencing global economics, interactions, and playing a pivotal role in the connections between nations and the educational system. Therefore, as we embark on this exploration, it is time to understand the impact of geopolitics in education, especially, specifically through language and literature, and more importantly, how geopolitics shapes our world and our worldviews. To get enlightened in this regard, it is our honor having Sudeep Chakravarti and distinguished research person in the very first forum. He is an associate professor of South Asian Studies and the founder director of ULAB's Center for South Asian Studies. His scholarly interests include South Asian geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'd like to invite Mr. Sudeep to deliver his insightful lecture for the faculty members and students of Department of English and Humanities.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ilani. Good evening, professors, colleagues, students, or should I say fellow students, because I consider myself to be a lifelong student. I began and never stopped. Um, Maybe it's getting to be a nasty habit, but anyway, we'll come to that later. I'm delighted to be invited and greatly honored that you thought of me, the department thought of me to have a conversation with you. I hope more than giving a talk or talking down to you or lecturing you. That is not the intention. The intention is really, ladies and gentlemen, to share some thoughts that I have, and I hope that will expand your awareness. I hope it will open a few doors and windows in your mind, body, and heart, and that you can take this forward to really you know, moving forward with your curriculum integration program. I will desist from speaking about the academic aspects of the CI program, and I will leave it to my dear colleague and senior uh, Kaiser Kai, whom you know as most of you know as Professor Kaiser Hawk, for the forthcoming week's conversation. He's far more suited to comment on such matters. I will restrict my comments on and my thoughts on aspects that I know I'm comfortable with, which is essentially geopolitics, how it plays out, and in my limited understanding and awareness, how I see it impacting on writing, on literature, in many ways, and as I see from the concept note on matters of communication and also all related matters. So my brief for this evening is that, and I wish not to overstep the brief because Mrs. Zilani very kindly introduced me as a researcher. I'm more a reader, my friend. But anyway, we'll come to that later. I think it is better, ladies and gentlemen, to begin um, with just setting the tone for it, for those of you who have not read the concept note as shared by the department, that when you talk about what is geopolitical, which is the first word of the talk this evening and the coming week, it's actually a study, if I may quote a dictionary, which is the usual stunt that we undertake during these talks, is to quote a dictionary. In this particular case, I'm quoting the Merriam-Webster. Uh, Geopolitical, in particular, not geopolitics, but geopolitical, is a study of the influence of such factors as geography, economics, and demography on the politics and especially the foreign policy of a state. I think that really is where we begin. And and when uh, we speak of these things, and when I started thinking about, I mean, I teach conflict studies. I talk about foreign relations all the time, globalization, geopolitics, and its cousin geoeconomics. They're related, and I also happen to be teaching some aspects of South Asian literature or modern literature. And when I started to think about what it really, what it all adds up to, I couldn't but help thinking that, it, from the very beginning of our consciousness, if you will, in terms of sort of recording uh, thoughts into literature, which really began with myths and evolved into what we call mythologies. When you talk about, when I take this definition of geopolitical and then apply it to that, I see that, all my childhood readings, which follow me to this day, and it hasn't left any student of literature or history behind. We look at these myths like the Trojan War. I mean, the whole myth, for instance, of the Helen of Troy, and Troy being invaded by the Achaeans because you had this fabulous beauty Helen, uh, the Achaean prince was besotted. The Achaean prince, the queen Helen, whom the Achaean prince Paris was besotted by, and brought her to Troy, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is geopolitics in its sense. Even though it began with a sense of being besotted and with a sense of being obsessed with a person, it began a war between two states, and you had the Trojan War, the myth of the Trojan War, and the Trojan horse, and so on and so forth. And when I bring it closer home to the myth of the Ramayana, the epic text that we have in South Asia, the Ramayana, it was a geopolitical setting where the ruler of Lanka, Ravan, or Ravan, as we say in Bangla, went into what effectively was the heartland of central India, central northern India, and abducted Sita or Shita and took her away to Lanka, and essentially triggered and again over, maybe it was sort of a war of a possession in a reprise, if you will, of the Trojan War, but effectively it was a geopolitical event. Two kingdoms were fighting, two absolutely different peoples were fighting, two different cultures were fighting far apart over, and it sort of evolved into this grand battle over right and wrong. I mean, many of our mythologies are geopolitical as well. And when we come closer home, when we look at certain aspects of where we have come, and let me over here, I will share a few visuals with you from time to time to impress upon you exactly what I mean. And do be patient with me when I begin to share my screen from time to time. I'll sort of go in and out. And alongside, I hope, illuminating a few points for you, it'll also make this conversation a little less boring for some of you. So here we go. Um, I want to share a little uh, map with you. And we talked about, your concept note spoke of maps. And even though Mr. Zilani didn't really mention that, it goes beyond borders and it goes beyond countries, I would actually posit that actually maps are very important and countries are very important. And I'll talk to you about a few things. We can talk about things in a global sense, and I will. I will keep zooming out. I will keep zooming back in from the world to South Asia, to Bangladesh, to our neighborhood, because that's also the way in several ways we understand things a little better. Let me present to you the map of what we know as the British Indian Empire. And as I say this to you, uh, note the time, note the writing that happened during that time. And the British Empire came about, as you might know, as an economic enterprise, but it transformed itself into a geopolitical enterprise as well. Because when, after the British East India Company, the French East India Company, the Dutch and the Danes, and all came to South Asia, very quickly they were backstopped, they were back-ended, if you will, by the governments of their respective countries, by the kings and queens and rulers and prime ministers and presidents and administrators of the respective countries. So may have begun with the economic necessity, but it was very, very closely aligned with a political necessity and therefore a geopolitical necessity, because it crossed borders. It went from Europe right onto across 7,000 kilometers further east onto South Asia. And that is one of the reasons why we speak English, as I like to say. We could well have been speaking French if the French won the Battle of Plassey, for instance, or Palashi Juddho as we know it. But keeping this map in front of you, let me read to you a few lines from an empire writer, a famous empire writer, and Rudyard Kipling. And I quote,
Sudipta,
yes.
did you change the slide by any chance? Because we can only see the first slide.
No,
But the slide.
I did change the slide.
No, we can't see it.
Well, can you see this? I changed the slide. Maybe.
No, we're just seeing the slides. We're seeing your PowerPoint, but it's not in full screen mode, and we're just seeing the title slide now.
I have actually shown.
Okay, now it changed.
Okay, so then maybe I'll show it in this mode. It'll be better.
Yeah, we can see it now.
All right. So when I show you the map of the British Indian Empire, and let me just go back and repeat myself a little bit when I spoke, just to sort of contextualize this map, which you now can see. It was a trading exercise, as I mentioned a little earlier, which was immediately backed by the governments of the day. So it became a geopolitical exercise as much an economic or trading exercise at that point of time. And that is how the British Indian Empire came to be controlled from, in the beginning, Leadenhall Street, which was the East India Company headquarters in London, on Leadenhall Street, and thereafter by Whitehall, which was the British Foreign Ministry. So that is how you have geopolitics into our part of the world. And let me, as I was about to quote before, Arifa very kindly reminded me that the slides were going a little off. I'll quote you something that Rudyard Kipling had written. And Rudyard Kipling, as many of you will know, is one of the best known empire writers, poets, novelists, and diarists, if you will. And when Mr. Kipling spoke of the white man's burden, or in particular, when he wrote these lines from a poem in the book called Stocky and Co. Bear with me on this, and I quote Mr. Kipling here. And when he would write lines like, "Some beneath the further stars bear the greater burden, set to serve the lands they rule. Save he serve no man may rule. Serve and love the lands they rule, seeking praise nor guerdon." When he wrote words like this, he was actually sort of validating the geopolitical exercise and creating literature for it. He is your classical empiricist, if you will, in literature, who married the whole concept of geopolitics of the day and wrote about it. I mean, you have a direct connection between geopolitics and literature right there. When I take it a little further, and I'll keep the map there for a while, and I'll speak to you about a few other things before we go on. And since we're talking about the British Indian Empire, let me talk about an aspect of another aspect of colonial rule, the Belgians in Africa. And let me quote you another aspect of literature and another writer, whom I'm sure most of you have heard of, Joseph Conrad, and his famous book called Heart of Darkness, where Mr. Conrad expanded on the ill effects of colonialism in Africa and essentially uh, highlighted the Belgian enterprise and absolute horror of the Belgian enterprise in that geo-economic uh, this economic enterprise, which very, very quickly uh, evolved into a political enterprise, a geopolitical enterprise for the control of Africa. The Belgians were not the only ones doing it. The British were in Africa, the French were in Africa, the Portuguese, the Germans, the Dutch to an extent, the British, of course, they were all there. Uh, and so, when you talk about geopolitics or geopolitical and you marry it to literature, you will find, my friends, that it goes back a long, long time ago. It is not necessarily a new thing, only that we encounter ever newer concepts, ever newer iterations, ever newer versions of the geopolitical and literature and writing that we continually go with. When you talk about wars, for instance, which is an aspect of geopolitics, take the First World War, which is something that we Pratham Vishwa Juddha, as we would say in Bangla. The First World War was your classic, if it may be called that, example of a global war, a vast geopolitical enterprise to between one group led by the British, the Allies, if you will, and the early Axis powers, led by the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany at its head. And you have people, and I noticed in the concept note, and I'm very happy that it was mentioned, that it spoke of the role of literature and it spoke of the role of language in communicating to the world at large. It spoke of the role of literature in pushing back. So, can I, in the context of the First World War, mention again a classic novel, which is called an anti-war novel, which I hope some of you have read. And if not, please read the book and please see the movie if you can. It's on Netflix. It's called All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. It is a anguished novel on the horrors and the horrors of geopolitics of the First World War. And that novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, pushes back eloquently, horrifically, and very emphatically against the idea of the imposition of geopolitics and the reality of war and the horrors of war, and how it's not just about one region and the other region, or one country and the other country, which we spoke of in the beginning, or colonial enterprises or empires, but it can involve the entire world, as with the First World War, the Second World War. But let me go back to the slide and introduce you, to narrow it down for you a little bit to our part of the world. But before I go there, because we lose the thread otherwise, I wanted to share with you certain aspects of communications, and I'm sure, and I hope that we can come back to it when we do the Q&A as well. I couldn't help think of how communication or miscommunication can create tension between countries, and how language can play such a fabulous role in diplomatic endeavor to bring warring parties, if you will, warring countries, warring people together, or in certain cases, in discrete language, can create tensions or ratchet up tensions. We know how polite language can bring people together, but just for the sake of how impolite language can pull people apart, let me quote you something that something that is relevant to Bangladesh's context, for instance, especially in the context of Richard Nixon, who was the US president at the time of the Bangladesh War, and Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State at the time of the Bangladesh War. And there was a situation where you had people when and India was on one side. It was your classic geopolitical enterprise. Even though it seemed like Bangladesh was fighting Pakistan, or the future Bangladesh was fighting Pakistan, it was also geopolitically intertwined with the Indian intervention, which actually also helped the birth of Pakistan. Equally, it became a geopolitical enterprise because the US, United States, and China were supporting Pakistan. And along with India, the Soviet Union of the time, the old Russia of the time, Soviet Union, was supporting Bangladesh. So it became a proxy war. So 1971, ladies and gentlemen, was actually not just a neighborly enterprise, or what began with a war within Pakistan, the idea of Pakistan, or the idea of the Bengali language being suppressed or oppressed by the idea of Urdu and the idea of the Western Pakistani idea of Pakistan. It actually evolved and grew into a geopolitical enterprise, which was fought back by words. But let me, in terms of miscommunication, let me quote you what Mr. Nixon was speaking of in terms of when he was speaking to describe Indira Gandhi, who Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger both hated, because they hated the idea was that India, with Soviet Union's backing, was intervening on behalf of East Pakistan, or the Mukti Jodhas, or Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's grand plan, and the Awami League's plan for a future Bangladesh free of the domineering control of Pakistan / Urdu / the military regime of the day. So Richard Nixon would actually go out and call Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, would call her things like old, or that old witch in official or in conversations with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who, in my opinion, is a war criminal, but that's for another time and another place. Mr. Kissinger would describe Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, as bitch. And since we are discussing literature and we are in ULAB, we can be free with speech and expression. I'm quoting you. I'm not making this up. This may sound obscene, but this is reality of undiplomatic communication, if you will. And when they were complaining about India's intervention, Mr. Kissinger was telling Mr. Nixon, I mean, you know how they are. I quote Mr. Kissinger, the Indians are bastards anyway. So it was unquote. So it was entirely expected for Indira Gandhi and the Indians to intervene in the way they did. It is not the words of peace. These are the words of war. And when Mr. Kissinger was caught out several years later, that you cursed Indira Gandhi, you called the Indians bastards, and you're on the wrong side of history. Mr. Kissinger had this to say. I quote him here: "The foul language has to be seen in the context of a Cold War atmosphere 35 years ago, when I had made a secret visit to China and India had made a kind of alliance with the Soviet Union." So he was indiscreet, and then later, when the context changed, he became discreet and fawning and diplomatic. So the same man who called someone a bitch and the Indians are bastards anyway, 35 years later, when he was asked about the same things, explained it in the most diplomatic manner with absolute eloquence, and let bad blood be kept behind, and let's move on into a brave new world. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is how things can work. And I'll give you another example. Since we're talking about the Cold War, there's a famous instance. You may have heard of the Russian premier, Nikita Khrushchev, who nearly fought a war with the United States. It was sort of triggering a world war almost with the United States over what we know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And and this is amusing because I mentioned Richard Nixon. When Richard Nixon was not the president, but he was in fact the vice president. He was the vice president of America, and Mr. Nixon had visited Moscow when Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union, and they were visiting a sort of an exhibition of modern kitchenware, of all things. And they were arguing, and Mr. Nixon sort of wagged his finger on the face of Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev responded in Russian, and that also escalated. It sort of grew into a diplomatic incident when he said, you go F dash dash K, my grandmother, who the hell are you to speak like this? And this is how people would speak. And this same man would 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 create this sort of iconic statement of the Cold War when something that he said after drinking several glasses of vodka, he said when he was speaking about America and America's domination and America's clash with the Soviet Union, Mr. Khrushchev was recorded to have said, "We will bury you." Now, these are not words of diplomacy. These are not words of peace. These are words of war. And the world is a crazy place, friends, and words, places, and communication, miscommunication can sometimes be quite insane. Mr. Khrushchev also is famously known for picking up his shoe literally at the United Nations General Assembly. And when the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was speaking, he actually, in protest, Nikita Khrushchev picks up his shoe and bangs the table at the United Nations and says, that was his communication. So, in a lighter note, I just wanted to mention this to you in terms of how crucial language and words and approach and body language can be in times of crisis, and how necessary they are in terms of de-escalation, of de-escalating a sense of crisis and a sense of conflict and a sense of war and a sense of geopolitical necessity, to tone it down to lower temperatures. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the job of diplomats. This is the job of negotiators. Fortunately, we have them, which is why I guess the world hasn't self-destructed already. Now, from there, let me go back to sharing with you aspects of the British Indian Empire, the geopolitical aspects of the British Indian Empire, and also where it comes to us in terms of how literature communicates this to us. So now, when I move from here, I move to this particular aspect, which is pre-partition British India. What you see is the religion-based map of South Asia. And it very quickly moves to this, where the princely states of South Asia and the British ruled territories of South Asia are already choosing to become allied with one bloc, which is Pakistan, and another bloc, which is India. And in 1947, over 14th and 15th of August 1947, you have the reality of Pakistan and India. And of course, this map also shows Bangladesh, so it's a post-1971 map. And what you have, ladies and gentlemen, is that from what was in effect a seamless enterprise, even though this is a geopolitical aspect of South Asia, which is part of the colonial enterprise, when this begins to take a border after partition and becomes this, you actually have a geopolitical situation in what was once a seamless British Indian enterprise, from Pakistan from Pakistan in the west to Myanmar, present-day Myanmar in the east. And suddenly, almost overnight, within the span of a year, you have three countries, Pakistan, India, and Myanmar. And in 71, and the old Burma, which later became Myanmar. And then you have, in 71, Pakistan, the eastern aspect of Pakistan, Purba Bongo, Purba Pakistan, in effect becoming Bangladesh. When you have this kind of a situation, then simple matters of literature, which can be seen as cultural literature, which can be seen as social commentary, can suddenly take on the tone of a geopolitical commentary or geopolitical writing. What is a commentary on a slice of life, as seen in Bombay, as seen in India, as seen in the greater India, can suddenly take on the lifeblood of suddenly geopolitics. Suddenly two countries, again, Pakistan with the backing of America and China, India with the backing of the emergent and the steadily going more powerful Soviet Union. And I present you a classic example of how a writer, the work of a writer, almost overnight becomes from social commentary to a commentary on partition, which is the root of India and Pakistan's geopolitical tensions, if you will, the tension between two countries, or the tension not just of religion, but effectively the tension of the borders that leads itself to Mr. Manto, Sadat Saab, who is the most brilliant short story writer, uh, suddenly became an Indian writer, was transformed into a Pakistani writer. So if you do a Google search on Sadat Hasan Manto, you will see him described as a Pakistani writer, not an Indian writer, because that is a post-partition reality. And his wonderful, wonderful partition short stories, Toba Tek Singh, uh, among the very many, are outstanding examples of what I would consider to be the earliest sort of examples of post-partition slash partition slash geopolitical literature in the Indian in the South Asian subcontinent, or in the South Asian space of borders or created borders or imposed borders on account of socio-political upheaval, on account of very many reasons of religion, society, you name it. And of course, for your interest, if you choose to go into Sadat Saab's works, please feel free. He's got a ton of books in Urdu, in Hindi, in English. Of course, there are excellent translations. I'll be happy to share it with you later. And as you can see from this, there are also Sadat Hasan Manto's works translated into Bangla. So do dig in, ladies and gentlemen, and you will see what I'm talking about when you contextualize it in the sort of the geopolitical context of India and Pakistan. Another book that I would refer to, which suddenly became a sort of South Asian commentary, a geopolitical commentary in certain ways, is A Train to Pakistan, a novel by Khushwant Singh. The cover that you see is one of the early covers of Mr. Singh's novel, and I know that many of you read his books as part of your DEH curriculum. And this is a classic example. And let me sort of give you another example of we speak in terms of post-partition, we speak in terms of 1971 or Akatur in Bangladesh, but let's talk about certain books that are written, for instance, in Pakistan. I bring to you a book by my friend Mohammad Hanif, who's an absolutely brilliant writer of prose and a wonderful speaker. And I bring to you an example of his absolutely runaway crackerjack novel called A Case of Exploding Mangoes. Now, why do I put this? Why do I include this in a conversation about geopolitical aspects of writing and literature, or literature and writing? Because if you talk about the context in which Mohammad Hanif writes his novel, A Case of Exploding Mangoes, it actually takes from a real life situation, which is that President Zia-ul Haq, who was a martial law administrator and president of Pakistan, actually died in a plane crash along with the American ambassador to Pakistan and a whole host of top generals, senior generals of Pakistan's army. After all, martial law, and General Zia was, former chief of staff of the Pakistan army, who later led Pakistan, so on and so forth. And it was a real life situation. And the Afghan war had begun, the Soviet invasion had taken place. Soviet Union was at the doors of Afghanistan. Pakistan and America together had been funding the Mujahideen, which spawned Al Qaeda in a future, the Taliban and Al Qaeda in many ways. And from that enterprise, you have what I would call the sort of the follow-on effect of not quite a geopolitical novel, but the story that came to be because of geopolitical realities is, for instance, writers like Khaled Hosseini, who wrote books like The Kite Runner in a sort of geopolitical context of Afghanistan within which it was written. So similarly, A Case of Exploding Mangoes. Mohammad Hanif writes this brilliant satire about Pakistan society and politics of the time, but it is actually the context of it is very geopolitical. I urge you to read the book. If you can't get hold of a printed copy, please reach out to me. I will share a PDF copy. Don't quote me on this. Mohammed is a good friend, but I wish him well. We shouldn't be. Sometimes we don't have a choice but to share work. I will now travel to Kashmir, and this is I'm deliberately showing you this image. Kashmir is to my mind um, a lost geography, a lost political geography, which since 1947 has been caught up in the geopolitical enterprise of Pakistan on one side and India on one side, China on the third side, and sort of three-pronged pressures on Kashmir, where Kashmiris no longer have a voice of their own. Largely, they're spoken for by India, Pakistan, and China. They have no, and when they protest, you have people shooting at them, you have people marauding them, you have people injuring them, you have people torturing them, you have people uh, firing pellet guns at them. And this is one of the images from a few years ago when it was done as a protest, when they superimposed, critics superimposed the pellet gun effects instead of children, like you see in Gaza today, infants, children who were blinded and some were killed on account of pellet guns, pellets being fired at them, pellets being fired at them, rubber bullets being fired at them. And here you have a depiction of Amitabh Bachchan, Narendra Modi, Shah Rukh Khan, and Mark Zuckerberg as portrayed here as a sign of protest. But when you speak of literature, pushing back and pushing back at this sort of geopolitical reality, which disallows Kashmiris to claim Kashmiris for themselves. You have books like my friend Basharat Peer, who wrote this absolutely marvelous non-fiction book. It's not a novel; it's a work of non-fiction. When Basharat wrote this book back in 2008, it was published in 2008, and he's written this absolutely wonderful political travelogue, if you will, about the reality of the space and time in Kashmir. And it's got a lovely evocative title called Curfewed Night. Again, if you want to read it, I urge you to reach out to me if you wish to get a glimpse of it. Now, speaking of a female writer, a woman writer, who has written a book, a novel called Rumors of Spring, is Farah Bashir. It's sort of a memoir written with a novelistic overture, very, very novelistic technique, fiction technique in the writing, a beautifully written book, A Girlhood in Kashmir, Rumors of Spring. And it's so evocative when you have literature uh, commenting on the political situation, commenting on the human rights abuses, and again, I stress, commenting on the reality of Kashmir, which forces people to be stuck in this particular enterprise. And in my own small way, even I've commented on certain aspects of the reality of northeastern India, where if you see this map over here, where I'm roving the cursor, you will see that beside the map of northeastern India, you have Bangladesh, you have Bhutan, and you have Myanmar. So this book actually, there are 3 chapters on Bangladesh in this book. There is a chapter and a half on Myanmar. It talks about this Eastern South, what I call Eastern South Asia, and the geopolitical nature of this region and the geopolitical dynamics and the interplay of India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, which you're seeing in the collapse of Myanmar every day. The effect of it, the effect it is happening on Bangladesh, on Myanmar itself, and on India. This book discusses it. So it's literature. It's in this particular case approached as creative nonfiction, uh, ex- discussing aspects of geopolitics, of geoeconomics, of international relations through literature. When you talk about Nepal and the conflicts of Nepal, how Nepal morphed in the mid 1990s in a 10-year period from a monarchy, an absolutely repressive monarchy, to a functional democracy. You have friends like you have books as written by my friend Manjushri Thapa, who wrote this book called Forget Kathmandu, an elegy for democracy, which was a sort of a wishful enterprise. She was heartbroken as to what was happening in Nepal, which was sandwiched geopolitically between China and India, and has been so for decades, and suffers because of this pulls and pushes of geopolitics in this tiny country, beautiful country. And it was falling apart, and it had, even though it was dealing with its own a war with itself, it also had to deal with the geopolitical pressure that India and China were putting on its future. and its present, including the rebellion, including the monarchy, including present in Nepal. And Manjushi's book is terrific. It's again a political travelogue. You could call it creative nonfiction, if you will, which discusses this absolutely painful and seminal moment in Nepal's politics and geopolitical location on the map, precisely because of its location on the map. A book of fiction, a beautiful novel called Palpasa Cafe by Narayan Wagle. When we moved to Sri Lanka and its war, out of the war in Sri Lanka came a Booker Prize winner of 2022, a book called The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, written by my good friend Shehan Karunatilaka, who took the war in Sri Lanka, which was not just with the Tamil people and between the Tamil and the Sinhala people, but it actually became a geopolitical situation because India intervened in the Sri Lankan Civil War. Singapore intervened in the Sri Lankan Civil War by providing offshore funding for both the rebels and the Sinhala people. The UAE intervened indirectly. Israel was supplying weapons to the Sri Lankan army. So if you can say that even though it was between Tamils and the Sinhalese people, the Sinhala people, it actually became a geopolitical extension in many, many ways. It became a proxy war. And Shehan actually, using the device of magic realism, speaks of this war, articulates this war, and pushes back by exposing so many atrocities of the war. And we come to the Rohingyas, which I'm sort of coming towards the end of my presentation to you, after which we can talk about, we can get to a Q&A. Let me sort of bring it closer home. Let me talk to you about the Rohingya people. How many of you know, and I hope you do, if you don't, I'm sharing this with you, how many of you know that there are actually Rohingya writers who are using this absolute depredation, this complete horror of the Rohingya people, whom I describe as the Palestinians of South Asia? I'm on the record, I write about it, and I mention this phrase, I talk about it at every opportunity and every forum. I call them the Palestinians of South Asia. How many of us know that there are actually Rohingya people? And when we talk about literature and geopolitics and the Rohingya migration, or the Rohingya genocide, if you want to call it that, is a result of Myanmar pushing them out. But but now Bangladesh is involved, another country, because the Rohingyas have come here. But they're not going back because Bangladesh reaches out to India and China, but neither China or India is helping Bangladesh with the Rohingya repatriation, because both India and China have major economic and political interests in Myanmar. So Rohingyas have become a geopolitical situation. They've become part of a geopolitical black hole, and from which they're writing back, they're pushing. And let me share something with you. And here, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a situation, and I'll end over here. I present you literature in the making as we speak. Rohingya literature is being born to depict this horror and this effect of geopolitics, the horror of politics for which they're suffering. This is let me play for you. Let me share with you. Can you see the screen of this young boy? Lead me from the camp. Rohingya poetry. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Sir.
All right. So now and his English is not very good, but listen to what he has to say. Listen to what he has to say.
Lift me from the camp. The wall is too blind to see my love fallen in the camp. As a human being, let me out of it. I have so many gigantic dreams. Let me build something for future. I'm an innocent Rohingya, but suffer in modern oppression. I think about my past in life, but I have nothing for future. I'm just surviving in a small shelter, more difficult to breathe once, with so many tension and fears. My heart forced to show you enough. Sometimes I seek to leave this world. Passing away is better than living in the present. Let me be a man for my community. Let me live this present, which lets me into the present. My eyes welled up in tears. Life is a theory. Now is to grow up. Not just to live and just die. The whole world is too deep and truly. Finally, I had been made a refugee. No one cares about me. Why am I here? No one thinks about me. Why am I here?
Now, so do you see what I mean? That, you have, his English is not very good. Uh, uh, are we? His English is not very good, and his words are imperfect, but his thoughts, his passion are crystal. And here, ladies and gentlemen, you see the birth of literature, where someone is being transplanted from Rakhine and they're in Bangladesh in camps, and they're creating literature. From this kind of oral history comes written history. From this kind of transference of geography on account of geopolitics comes, and the refugee status is made permanent because of geopolitics, almost exactly like the situation in Palestine and Gaza and West Bank, where you have the 1948 literature and the 1975 literature being rewritten since 7th of October 2023. That is how literature is born, ladies and gentlemen. That's how people push back with literature. You were talking about pushing back with literature. This is how it happens, and I hope that some of you, as researchers, when you grow into writers or translators or academicians or researchers, you help these people like this young boy translate Rohingya from the Rohingya dialect into Bangla or Rohingya into English, help them grow and create collections, take their words to the world, like they want so much to take their words to the world. Let the literature fly. And that is the power of literature, ladies and gentlemen. And I will end with this just one map. And this is the map that I will show you. I mean, all you see is borders, borders, borders everywhere. Mrs. Zilani was talking about the absence of borders and how maps or whatever, but I will posit to you that the whole problem is because there are borders. And we don't have too many tools at our disposal besides diplomacy and communications and literature, poetry, cinema, novels, short stories, creative nonfiction, academic nonfiction, whatever it is, commentary, our voices, to ensure that these borders don't destroy us. We push back. And you are in the universe as students of DH, you're bang in the middle of the universe, whose duty, whose life is to study this pushback, study this communication, uh, and live it. You're the living, breathing part of this literary engagement, this engagement of communication, and this literary pushback. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And I, as you can see, I get passionate about this. I'm getting increasingly worked up about this because, ladies and gentlemen, this is my life. I am a writer. I engage, I communicate. I'm just not a professor or a visiting professor of literature or teaching an elective course in South Asian literature at DH. I am a writer. This is my life. I will engage I will push back against every form of whatever. Sorry, stop. I'm so sorry. This is not a political speech. It is a forum for curriculum integration, and I wouldn't want to contribute to disintegration. So, Mrs. Zilani and Arifa, I will stop here and take any comments or criticisms or breakbacks or questions or anything that you have to have. My apologies if I've gone on a bit long, but we began a little late. And as you know from my class, I do tend to get a little carried away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your lecture. And definitely it is an insightful one. I believe students and faculty members has got a lot of food for thought to connect the issues related to geopolitics with the course content, and specifically the last video clip which you have shown that summarizes everything, how geopolitical issues are shaping our realities, people's realities. So at this stage, it's time to take some sort of questions, and however, I'd like to request Shamsud sir to share his comments on this particular talk. Shamsud sir, please.
So Shuribda, so this was really, really amazing. And what I really liked about your presentation is that the way you seamlessly introduced all these authors from South Asia and beyond, and to reflect on the not only the diplomatic language. So you started from the mythical period and you have come to the contemporary myth making, that with this mapping, border crossing, and finally coming to the Rohingya issue. So it hits home really hard. So really, really grateful for your reflection. And I can understand so the passion with which you ended the talk, because that's what literature is all about, right? So it's all about opening up our imagination, and appealing to our raw senses. Especially at a time when you have Ukraine war going on, you have this Gaza mowing the lawn going on, and so we have heard about Kashmir, we have heard about Toba Taksin, so Manto and others. So I'm sure so this will give enough raw material for our students to reflect on the geopolitical reality. I'm just curious about what you think about this Putin interview. Have you watched it? Long
Which one?
with
I mean, because I've watched several.
Tucker Carlson one, the recent one. He gave
I
a
have, I have, but for the edification of our colleagues, do you want to mention something specific,
No,
do go ahead? I'm sorry.
No, I'm just curious because he spoke for 2 hours, because you talked about conflict resolution and you mentioned Khrushchev, and I was thinking of Sting, the police song,
Indeed,
and this I will bury you, so
Indeed.
and so I hope he loves his daughters too, so it's that famous song by Sting.
Indeed.
And so but when you were talking about Khrushchev, and so I was thinking of so Putin saying that so he reached out to President Clinton, President Bush, saying that now that we have discarded so communism, so called so no longer USSR, can we be part of NATO, right? And twice 2 presidents, so they agreed to this idea. They're it's very interesting. And then they went to the deep state, and the deep
Right.
state did not allow them to so because of the in the industry, was the ammunition industry and the arms industry, they didn't allow them to have that kind of peace deal. So I'm just curious, so when you have a fictive presentation of these border issues, conflict issues, and then you have the real issues. I'm glad that you mentioned your own book, which is very relevant for our time, The Eastern Gate. So how do you draw a line between fact and fiction? And so just my last comment would be, so I'm particularly intrigued by Arundhati Roy, for example. So she started as a fiction writer, and then for 20 years, so she went on a hiatus. And again, she picked up her second novel, say almost 20 years later. So at what point you realize that, so fact is not enough, you resort to fiction? Or at what point you realize that fiction is not enough, you need to deal with facts head on?
Well, Arundhati Roy is a good example, since you meant. But Mr. Putin, I mean, that was the one. It's good of you to mention that. But I, you know, it's interesting when you talk about Mr. Putin saying that he reached out and the deep state prevented him. One has to, and of course, Tucker Carlson won't do it, so let us do it for him. That the fact is that Mr. Putin was himself part of the deep state. In fact, he was a very deep state. He was the deepest part of the deep state
Yes,
and has always
of
been
course.
so. So I mean, of course, you get away with this kind of rubbish. I'm sorry, as a writer, I can say what I want, huh? But I am wearing a ULAB lanyard, so I will stop at rubbish. I won't go beyond that. Please note that I rode on the shoulders of Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Nixon to use expletives, right? So I'm a clever boy that way. But coming to Arundhati Roy,
So you can always use F dash dash K.
which I did, which is exactly what I did. But I
Yeah, I
mean,
know.
I sanitized it for our young colleagues, right? And that, of course, is a complete work of the complete assumption of fictional assumption, because factually they know everything there is to know, right? Uh, can I see some emojis, ladies and gentlemen, of saying at this point of time? See, thank you very much. Uh, so, but coming to Arundhati Roy very quickly, I know that we are a bit squeezed for time. I think it is and I mean, I can speak for her. She took a break because, and she's mentioned this in numerous interviews and also addressed on video. On, you can get these interviews on YouTube, and of course the print interviews, which are now online as well, where she talks about the fact that when she wrote The God of Small Things, after she wrote The God of Small Things, which addressed very many important issues in a very evocative manner. As you know, many of you study The God of Small Things in DEH. She got engaged with the political movements of the day in India. She's always been a very vocal person. Before she wrote The God of Small Things, she wrote long essays on caste system, on violence against women. I mean, in fact, she came to be known for that. She even wrote a couple of screenplays for movies. And after all that, she wrote The God of Small Things. So she had a avatar, a literary persona, even before she wrote The God of Small Things. But after The God of Small Things, if you, as you would all know, she engaged herself politically with the goings on in India of the time, including in Kashmir, including with climate change, with environmental aspects, with human rights violations in India, in, including aspects of Hindu nationalism or atrocities against the Dalits in India. So many things. So I think she took a conscious decision that she would engage with these issues, with fiction, with essays, with engagement, with talk. That is when her global travels really began. Not to accept the Booker Prize for The God of Small Things, but after that, when The God of Small Things were done, Arundhati Roy must have traveled the globe a dozen times over, speaking her mind about social, economic, and political and geopolitical issues, for instance, about Kashmir. And then I think she found the time and place in her life where she felt situated enough to write The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, her second novel, which came after a 20-year gap. Speaking for myself, I write both fiction and nonfiction. And certain aspects, like when I talk about conflict issues and conflict resolution, maybe it's because of my journalistic background, I am somewhat more comfortable in dealing with these issues as creative nonfiction or as narrative nonfiction, or for instance, like Battle of Plassey Palashidjuddho, as sort of narrative historical nonfiction, if I want to call it that, sort of a popular history with very solidly researched history, so on and so forth. So I think it is. I wanted to write about Goa, but I took the form. I adopted the form of a novel to address that. I've written a couple of sort of what you might call Bildungsromans, fiction. So I think it depends on from writer to writer, situation to situation, context to context, and comfort level. What a writer feels is best suited, the medium that she or he feels best suited to write in. The form could be poetry, could be a screenplay, could be a play, scripting a play, could be a short documentary, could be a graphic novel. There are so many mediums now that literature opens to us. Please. Thank you.
All right. So we got a few questions in the chat box. The first one is, which I asked, in fact, how is technology shaping geopolitical dynamics of the present world? And we got another question, how do language and literature influence geopolitics? And what is
Only
the
one question at a time.
One question at a time. Please
Yeah.
don't group questions for me. It's very confusing.
all right.
My sincere apologies. One question at a time. I'm a middle-aged man. Please don't forget.
All
My
right,
attention
absolutely
span,
fine.
I'm a sort of a unifocal guy. So for me, multitasking becomes a bit of an issue. Uh, so, Mrs. Zalani, your question, how is technology affecting geopolitics?
Exactly.
Well, because you can respond uh, nearly at the speed of light uh, because of uh, because of how communications have developed. So, in several ways, where when geopolitics becomes a function, where practical geopolitics happens, country versus country, NATO versus Soviet bloc, India versus Pakistan, Myanmar versus its people, China versus India, Ukraine, Russia, whatever, everything moves through communication, through channel, through military communication, and it's absolutely super fast, a blink of an eye, less than a blink of an eye. Satellite communication, uh, satellite-led warfare, all kinds of offensive situations and defensive situations, strategy and tactics is as quick as it can get. It's now it's literally at the click of a mouse or the click of a button. It as speedy as that. Unlike what happened in the Second World War onwards, First World War, the Peloponnesian War, 1971. These were primitive wars in comparison, technologically primitive wars compared to today's uh, overall 360-degree geopolitical application of wars. Russia, Ukraine, West, even in Palestine. Now, that's one aspect. The other aspect is how geopolitics is affected because people like you and I can comment on geopolitical issues at also the speed of light or at the speed of social media or at the speed of WhatsApp or WhatsApp University, to be a little unkind to it. And the same way that I see many youngsters in Bangladesh pushing back against Coca-Cola company and PepsiCo, saying they will not drink. Small example, they will not drink Coca-Cola and PepsiCo because they bottle in Israel and they're pro-Israel and they will not speak against the war. So Bangladeshi youngsters are now drinking Mojo, which is also not a salutary thing to do necessarily, bad for health either way. One in Israel, Palestine, and one over here. It sort of kills you. I'm being facetious. Do forgive me, but I'm just trying to make a point that it's all happening so quickly. Communication and miscommunication, information and disinformation slash misinformation, all happens at the speed of light, literally, at this as quickly as your algorithms and your binary system, ones and zeros, transmit our communications and our images and our thoughts. It's super fast. That's how it's changed. So geopolitical communication and miscommunication, understanding and misunderstanding have rapidly escalated with the growth of technology, with the evolution of technology. I shudder to think how much quicker it can get. I mean, how much quicker can we be to either be friends or kill ourselves off in this sort of extinction event of technology? And so sorry, I'm going on a bit. My apologies. Thank you.
Exactly. And we got another question, that is, how do language and literature influence geopolitics, and what ethical dilemmas emerge in their use of navigating geopolitical landscapes? And the question came from Mr. Mehdi Hassan.
Right. Mr. Hassan, thank you for asking that. The thing is that it is nice, and here I may be a little contrarian. A writer writes, irrespective of the effect that the writer's writing will have on the immediate vicinity, the readership, or the world at large. I don't think a writer always writes for geopolitical attention or to change the course of history. I think that is an entirely delusional position that a writer would face. And I'm speaking frankly and bluntly. I'd love to think that, for instance, my writing, moves and shakes India or moves and shakes South Asia or a great part of the world, which has 2.5 billion people. But that is a delusional enterprise to even begin to think like that. When it is wonderful is when literature the beauty of literature is when it makes us aware of the world around us, including the geopolitical words. After all, geo in geopolitical means the world. It's a world politics that we're talking about. It's a global politics that we're talking about. It's embedded in the word geopolitik. It is, to use a sort of a German accent on that. It is embedded in that particular concept. So when it leads to debate, when it leads to awareness, it leads to curriculum integration programs like the one we are in right now. When it contributes to this, even one mind, one conversation, one mind, one poem turns one head, enough of the writer's work is done. If it turns 10, brilliant. If it turns 1,000,000, wunderbar. Arundhati Roy, hugely influential. Orhan Pamuk, hugely influential. Mo Yan, hugely influential. So many people, so many examples overall. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, so influential. For a sort of a pushing back at the Soviet enterprise. Today, writers are paying the price for speaking up against Putin. They're being killed. Writers have been killed in Palestine. Writers have been killed in America by white supremacists and hate speeches. Writers are being killed as we speak in South Asia. But writers write. They write because they must. A poet writes poetry because he or she must. Writers don't stop. They write. And that's such a wonderful, glorious thing to do. Thank you.
All right. We got another question from Mahdi Hassan as well, and that is, how does Arundhati Roy's provocative critique of geopolitical powers disrupt dominant narratives?
Well, thank you. But, narratives, Mr. Hassan, is actually who has the, unfortunately, the battle for narratives is a zero-sum game. Somebody has to win for somebody to lose. So the short answer to that, one can give a sort of a theoretical answer to that, but perhaps a practical answer to that is that for what Arundhati Roy writes and what she speaks, she has an audience. It's not necessarily an echo chamber where people who want to listen to that kind of writing and that kind of talk, reads, looks out for that kind of writing and that kind of speech or talk in order to validate or edify their own ideologies and thoughts and their political beliefs. That's one aspect of it. But there are always people who read her or listen to her fresh for the first time, generationally. She's written, the God of Small Things got the Booker in 1997. People are reading it today. Now, readers are in the third generation of the God of Small Things. People have listened to Arundhati Roy 20 years ago, non-fiction speeches, if I may call them non-fiction speeches. They're listening to her now. So she has her adherents, she has her listeners and her readers. But equally, there are people like Tucker Carlson, whom Professor Mortaza mentioned. There are people like Mr. Putin. There are people like Xi Jinping. There are people like Narendra Modi, who and their adherents, who will push a sort of a more totalitarian agenda. They will push a more, and there are enough writers, there are enough speakers who will also push that. And there is a right-wing literature. There's a genre. Literally, I'm saying literally. Actually, there is a genre that you can actually classify today as right-wing literature. And because there are books being written, fiction and non-fiction, glorifying, for instance, Ram, glorifying Shiv, glorifying the Chinese idea of one China, the Russian idea of one Russia, the white idea of America, the white idea of Brazil, the Sinhala idea of Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth, you see? So, it's sort of a us versus them thing at sometimes, but it has its effect, but I don't think it can it can totally take over. I mean, that will be a liberal dream, that if liberal thought or inclusive thought runs the world. I mean, that is a liberal writer's Midsummer Night's Dream, if you will.
All right. So we got two more questions, and these two questions came from our students. And the first one is, how can narrative nonfiction help to humanize individuals in conflict zones and help raise awareness?
Thank you very much for asking that question. May I know the name of the student who's asked that question?
Abrar Farhan Jaman.
Abrar, that's an excellent question. And in fact, that is something that I personally believe in. So if you will forgive me, I can speak from experience about this. And this is something that I teach, I talk about in class. This is something that I live and breathe in my own limited way, in my own tiny way, in the books of narrative nonfiction that I write. The whole idea of approaching it as narrative nonfiction, even though these are researched, very well researched works, even though I say so myself, because I know how hard I work on them. So, I know the effort I put into them, criticism apart or critiques apart. Uh, the whole idea, ladies and gentlemen, is to not dismiss a conflict or the aspirations and dreams and identities and ambitions and hopes and despair of or dreams of a people and in the wash of statistics. A dead person has a name. 10,000 dead people have faces and cultural histories. The Rohingyas are not 1 million displaced. They have names. There are people. Uh, the children of Gaza who have died are named. They lived and then they died or were killed. Which is why when you see documentaries on Al Jazeera or news on Al Jazeera on BBC, when you see these faces, when you see real flesh and blood people, flesh and blood alive and flesh and blood dead, that's when we are evoked. We are pushed into the zone of seeing these are people we're talking about. These are not numbers, as in Israeli Defense Forces would have us believe. These are real people. And that is the power of narrative nonfiction, because it humanizes conflict. It makes us understand the stories of people behind the numbers, behind the label, Manipuri, Tripuri, Chakma, Bengali vis-a-vis the relationship with Pakistan, Urdu and Bangla, or in India, or Dalits, or X or Y, or Ukrainian versus Russians, or Palestinians versus Israelis. When the human stories, the people stories, whether it's in war, whether it's after an earthquake, whether it's after a cyclone, whether it's after floods, or whether it's out of a climate crisis, or whether it's out of people being killed on the streets of this country for asking for better wages for tea plantations and garment workers. These are people. And they must be addressed in a humane, humanistic way. That is the power of literature. And I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that narrative nonfiction, or what you call creative nonfiction, if you must, is an extremely powerful tool to bring this conversation up front, to humanize conflict, and I hope, sincerely hope, add to the dialogue and understanding that will ultimately bring resolution of a particular conflict. So I see a very strong role that narrative/creative nonfiction plays in this matter. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And Zuaria Khan is asking, apart from the reflection of politics in literature, after it all takes place, does literature affect or shape politics for the times to come ahead?
I think literature or literateurs or writers would love to think that. But again, I think writing is done selflessly in this kind of writing, which engages with the present with an eye to the future, which looks at a better world, which looks at conflict resolution from a place of conflict, which looks, and this is not just conflict where people kill each other because of national or transnational identities. It can happen on account of domestic violence. It can happen because of gender violence. It can happen with all kinds of things, child abuse, or all manner of things. When writers write, Poets write poetry. People elocute. People write screenplays or made movies or screenplays or plays or writing period. Literature for me is a huge, huge universe. It's a big world. It's a total universe. When writers write this, they write with the hope to push for a better future. Science fiction, for instance, a lot of progressive science fiction hopes for that. Magical realism uses the trope of magical realism in order to satirize and talk about a sort of a present with an eye to the future. Political novels, socio-political novels, gender novels, women's feminist writing, all of it does selflessly, to my mind, writes to redress a wrong with an eye to the future without necessarily expecting anything in return, but hoping that it will change the narrative and contribute to a better situation, a more equitable world, a fairer world, for lack of another word. I know it's a very simplistic expression, but maybe more equity, a more equitable world. Let's not say fairer. Fair, unfair we can get into a whole different CI conversation about that. But a more equitable world, a more humane world, a more thoughtful world, and people write about it selflessly because they write. They have something to say, so they speak. They write, and that's the way literature works. And that is why literature is so very powerful, and it scares the hell out of totalitarians. It scares the hell out of absolutists. It scares the hell out of warmongers. That's the power of literature. The selfless nature of literature scares the hell out of these people because they know nothing except being selfish. They are not selfless. Literature is selfless. Politics is not. Geopolitics is not. Literature is. And what more can I say, ladies and gentlemen?
As you were talking about the equitable world, probably the one of the question asked by Mustafizur Rahman is kind of related. Should there be a worldwide referendum on hot social issues so we peacefully eliminate the way of life causes detriment of third world?
Now, my friend, and may I know the name?
Mustafizur Rahman.
Mr. Rahman, that is a good topic for you to write a futuristic novel to depict a world where the whole world will come together to discuss global issues without fear or favor and with complete engagement. Unfortunately, that world is not now. There is an agency called the United Nations, which is in a complete mess because that was designed to bring the whole world together and talk about it. But unfortunately, it is added to geopolitical stress and political stresses across the world. It does marvelously good things. It also adds to a lot of stresses. But in some ways, that world is being created by writers. That world is being created by movie makers. That world is being created by NGOs, or what we call civil society, who are coming together across the world at the speed of light or at the touch of a button or the click of a button and engaging and talking globally about issues. So in a way, your world has already come to pass. Your future had already come to pass, but the global positive benefits have probably not, the momentum is still not on the side of the angels, if you will. So you need to work harder, and I would sincerely recommend that you write that book, Mr. Rahman.
All right, we got another interesting question.
Okay, but no one's falling asleep at this point of time. I'm not, but I'm wired with coffee. But I don't know about your. We don't want integration to collapse into a sense of disintegration. So I leave it to Professor Arifa and Mrs. Zilani to decide when they should call an end to this.
Yeah. So we have one last question. I think Amrita Bhadra's question can be the last one, and that's
all right.
Thank you.
And the question is, are literature for indigenous or tribal writers who mostly fight for the rights of their community, which are usually considered minority, also considered to be driven by geopolitics?
Excellent question. I mean, in certain cases, yes, it can be like Rohingya is a good example. I can give you the example of several peoples or tribes or indigenous people in India who in an indirect way, in a sort of a once removed, twice removed manner, can be victims of geopolitics and geoeconomics. For, for instance, uh, take the case of, for instance, Adani Power, which is an Indian company which supplies 600 megawatts of power to Bangladesh from a plant in, I'm giving you a tiny example. There are millions of examples, literally, where 1600 megawatt is being created by Adani Power from a state in India called Jharkhand state, which is very close to the Bangladesh border. If you see the map, if you Google Adani Power Jharkhand, you will see how very close it is to the Bangladesh border. Unfortunately, the people who gave over land for that power project for the greater good of the friends of India, i.e., the people of Bangladesh, that is how the geopolitical, the political language works, communication works. Moitri, Bharat Bangladesh Moitri Jonne, if I may lapse into Bangla for for the sake of Bangladesh, you will find that there have been gross human rights violations in the procurement of the land against the tribal people, the indigenous people, the Adivasi, which is a loaded word in Bangladesh, for instance, who live there and have lived there for several thousand years. And so you might say that they are victims of geopolitics and geoeconomics. For instance, there are many examples. One can, it's in northeastern India where several dozen tribes have been affected because of border relations, India versus Bangladesh versus Myanmar. It happens to some extent in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. Myanmar is a living and breathing example of it, where Myanmar is fractured because of China, and Myanmar is looking at China, India, Bangladesh, and Thailand and Singapore to see how it plays out. Nobody's helping the Rohingyas, indigenous people of Myanmar, technically, who are being done out of Myanmar, and nobody's helping them because of geopolitical reasons. So yes, directly and indirectly, indigenous people, who I would describe as people who have lived in a geolocation, a geography, for a long time, long enough to claim it as their home, to be affected very strongly in many cases, directly and certainly indirectly, by geopolitics and geoeconomics. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insightful reflection on different questions. And we are almost at the end. And at this stage, I would like to request Arifa Rahman, head of the department, to share her vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Sudeep, for that brilliant talk. I think you covered so much ground and you've given us so much food for thought. I don't know where to begin, even thinking about integrating this. But thank you for covering a lot of ground actually and making it very relevant for literature, for the literature students and for the language students as well, because it all sort of comes together. And you talked a lot about how the students about the science fiction book that could potentially be written and things like that. And that's what we hope that our students will take this and do something with it that will be concretized sometime in the future, maybe in their lives, and they will play a part in making this a peaceful world and an equitable world, as you said. So thank you so much. I'm not going to be this. Yes, and thank you so much, Jilani, for organizing this. And Shams sir, thank you for making the time to be here. For all our colleagues also for being here, and of course our students. You have lots to think about tonight. And until next week, when Kaisa sir will be speaking to us in the second forum and making more concrete examples, using more concrete examples related to your courses directly in order to help you think about ideas on how you can take this concept and apply it to your courses. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Okay, then. Good night. Thank you, Sudeep. Thank you, Arifa. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
All right, then. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Well done, Jilani. Okay,
Thank you
fine.
so much.
Can we have a quick photo? Maybe if people can turn on their cameras and we can take a quick screenshot.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds attractive. So I'll remain online and visible.
Yeah, just a couple of seconds. People, if you can turn on your cameras quickly. Only Abrar. Okay. Yes, quickly, please. I think everyone's
Okay.
waiting for dinner.
All right. So I'll leave then.
Okay, just sorry, very quickly. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody. Stay well, stay safe. Bye-bye. And thank you again, DH, Arifa, and Mrs. Ilani. Bless you all the students and colleagues. Good night.
It was our pleasure. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone. Good night.